Now, most of that was lost by the time of Henry VI. Henry V was a great warrior, successful warrior king. His son Henry VI lost most of the territory. But the last major part of France that was held by the Crown of England and was lost was Calais. And that was in 1558, where you could say that the Norman Angevin English Empire came to a definitive end with the loss of Calais in the reign of Mary I. And that was 1558. So again, we're looking at roughly another 500 years where being English was tied up with France as more than just being English. It was England, Normandy, Angevin, France was all considered one unit. The problem of defining beginnings and ends of things is indicated also by the fact that one could still maintain there's a Norman connection because the Channel Islands, I think most people realize this, but perhaps not everyone, that the Channel Islands are what's left of the Norman territories. They are not part of the United Kingdom. They are in fact part of Normandy and our crown dependency. So one could still argue that the Queen still has a Norman connection even today. But effectively, the fall of Calais was the end of that empire. Now, almost at the same time, even earlier, if you go with the date of Cabot's landing in Newfoundland, is the beginning of what is known as the First British Empire. This starts either, you could say, with the landing of Cabot and claiming of Newfoundland, the new land and the new world for Henry VII of England in 1497, or the beginning of permanent settlement or attempts at settlement of Newfoundland in 1583. And this first British Empire lasts until the American Revolution. So you can either go with the 1776 when the 13 colonies declared their independence, or 1783 when the imperial government agreed to give the independence to the 13 colonies and the war ended. So again, here we're looking at a period of about 200 years. And these dates of this British Empire is important for Canada, for instance. If you go to the House of Commons, you'll see outside the doors of the House of Commons the image of Henry VII, because the Cabot's landing and the claim of Canada for Henry VII is deemed now to be the beginning of the Canadian monarchy or the Crown sovereignty over Canada. So that British Empire, unlike the Angevin Empire, which was European, was focused on the New World, particularly North America, but the first British Empire had also moved into India and was starting to make its inroads into Asia. Now, with the end of the 13 colonies, of course, Canada remained part of the British Empire. What is known as the Second British Empire then runs from the American Revolution, and in effect, I think this is, you can say, this sense of the empire ended in 1949, when India ceased to be the Empire of India and became first the Dominion of India under the King and then the Republic of India. So this second British Empire was in fact larger than the first. It included more colonies in Asia, more colonies in Africa, and the high point of British imperialism was, probably in terms of power, was in the late Victorian. In terms of actual territory, if you counted the League of Nations mandates, it was actually just after the First World War when the British Empire reached its greatest extent. And then in this survey, the Commonwealth, whether you started in 1931 or 1949, is the continuation of the fifth international entity to which Britain belonged. Now, what is this summary of these empires? What does that tell us? First of all, you notice that they all came to an end. And therefore, history tells us that all empires to this date have ended eventually, as have all associations of countries, all alliances. So history would suggest that the Commonwealth will come to an end at some point. It doesn't mean the Commonwealth's going to end tomorrow or 10 years from now. It may be 20 years, it may be 100 years, it may be 500 years. But I don't think one can assume that the Commonwealth of Nations is eternal. It would be unique if it was. Empires often become diminished. They become sometimes existing only in name, but they go on and on. The Holy Roman Empire lasted for centuries. It didn't officially end until I think it was 1801. It was early 1800s when Napoleon officially forced the end of the Holy Roman Empire. By that time, critics have described it that it was neither Holy Roman nor an empire, but it existed in name. So things go on longer. The Commonwealth may exist 500 years from now in name as strong as it is today, or maybe just a shadow of itself. It may last only another 20 or 30 years. We don't know. I'm not going to predict that. But I say history does seem to predict. There may be an exception in the future, but up till now, every empire or grouping of countries has come to an end at some point. The other thing that this survey has told us is if we look at the countries that once were part of the empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, plus the United Kingdom itself, is that the principles and institutions that were fostered and developed within an empire can continue in domestic circumstances after the empire that they once were intimately associated with no longer exists. So, for example, I mentioned that Britain was part of the Roman Empire. Well, no one thinks of that Britain has some special connection with Italy because of that, but at the coronation of the Queen in 1953, she was wearing the robes of a Roman consul. So Roman symbolism was still used in 1953 and will be used in the next coronation of the monarchs, reflecting the Roman origins of sense of governance and tradition. So there is a Roman link still today in the domestic coronation ceremonies of the United Kingdom and what through Canada and Australia after the Statute of Westminster became our coronation ceremonies. Parliament, our justice systems, all of these institutions are not modern creations in Britain or Canada, but have their roots and their foundations in medieval Britain at the time when the Angevin Empire was flourishing. So it's not just saying that Canada maintains traditions from the Victorian era. We do have some Victorian traditions in Britain and in Canada, but some of them go back to these early empires. They still exist in countries that make up the Commonwealth, but there is no longer an Angevin Empire. There is no longer a Roman Empire to which we belong. So you can lose the ties of the bigger organization and still retain the principles. So therefore, I do not necessarily expect, even if the Commonwealth should come to an end, that all the values or the principles that have characterized the Commonwealth would necessarily come to an end. However, now the point is to look at the Commonwealth itself over the last century or so. I talked about the different dates one could pick. I'm going to go earlier with the date of 1897, Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The early Victorian period was characterized in Britain by the strong support for people known as Little Englanders. Little Englanders were those who thought that the empire was of no use to Britain. It would be better for Britain to get rid of all the colonies, and free trade was the mantra of Britain. And free trade had become the principal economic view in Britain in the middle of the 19th century and has remained so right through till the 21st century. The colonies at that time, because of course Canada even had not become a dominion yet, had a very different view. They looked to the home country for economic help, and they believed in more protectionism. So you had this tension between protectionism and free trade in economic terms right from the middle of the 19th century. Now, the Little Englanders said, well, let's get, Canada should join the United States. We'd be better off let the Americans take it over. But not everybody held that view. And one in particular who didn't in the United Kingdom was Alfred Lord Tennyson. Now, Lord Tennyson in the 1860s had just issued his book, The Idylls of the King, which was the story of King Arthur, as all his collected works on King Arthur. And he wrote an additional poem for the book dedicated to Queen Victoria. And in that, his poem was an attack on Little England. It was a defense of the empire and Britain beyond the seas. The Britons who had gone to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and how they were important and they should not be abandoned by the home country. And in his attack on the Little Englanders, he coined an expression which we are all familiar with in Canada and was adopted by this country. He described Canada as the true North. Now, a lot of people, when I was a kid, used to tell me, the true North, they somehow thought it was as opposed to the false North. That now what the false North would be would make no sense, of course, but somehow, well, because the magnetic North Pole was in Canada, that somehow that's what meant by we were the true North, we were the real North, the other Greenland and Alaska were not the true North. Well, that's not what the term means. It's not what it ever meant. True means, in this context, what Tennyson meant was the other meaning of true, not true versus false, but true meaning loyal or faithful. The way one is true to one's wife, or true to one's husband, or to one's principles, or to whatever you want to say, that meaning of true, meaning loyal, faithful, loving. So what Tennyson put in his poem was that Canada was the true North, loyal to Queen Victoria. He was quite explicit. He wasn't making the illusion. That's what the line is actually referring to, Canada being true to Queen Victoria. Judge Robert Stanley Weir picked up the line, which had then became descriptive of Canada. People started referring to Canada as the true North and put it into, oh, Canada, the true North, strong and free. That's where we get the expression from. So it was the beginning of the imperialist reaction against Little Englanders that gave us the identity that we now think of as Canada, a slogan we use. So that's how we can draw something from our own imperial past. By the late Victorian period, however, the imperialists, if you will, had become the more dominant group, not the Little Englanders. They had outlasted the Little Englanders, and imperialism was at its heyday both in the United Kingdom and around the empire, particularly in the self-governing parts. Now, Canada by 1897 had been a self-governing dominion for 30 years. Australia was not yet founded. It was 3 more years. Australia was founded in 1900 as a federation, but the individual colonies, New South Wales, Queensland, they were already in existence, as was New Zealand. The South African, the Boer War had not yet taken place. It was just about to start, but the Cape Colony was already in existence. So Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee, there was the representatives, the Premier of Canada, and then the Premier of the smaller, what became Australia, but the smaller colonies of Australia, New Zealand's Cape Colony, were present at the Jubilee. And as a result of Victoria's Jubilee, that gave this sort of dramatic impulse to promoting the empire. And the celebrations of the Jubilee, the 1887 Jubilee of Queen Victoria, her Golden Jubilee, was focused on the royalty of the world. They all came, her relatives. It was a European focus in 1887. 1897, by conscious decision of the royal family and the British officials and the Dominion and colonial officials, it was an imperial celebration. 1897, the focus was on the British Empire, not the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha or House of Hanover that had been the focus in 1887. So it did change. So in 1897, I think, was an important date in pushing this forward. The question, though, became what form the empire was going to take. So I suggested this new imperialism, but that did not mean it was agreement as to what the new imperialism, the form it should take. The one thing that people in the colonies, certainly in the dominions, were adamant about, they were not going to be simply subordinate to the imperial government. That was not on the table. The real choices were between imperial federation and a more autonomous nations within the empire. That is, the imperial federationists believed that the future of the Commonwealth was, or the empire was, that there should be a really imperial government. Whether Westminster evolved into that or how, the details were, the people had variety of suggestions and choices, but the point would be that to Westminster probably that there would be representatives from Canada, from Australia, from New Zealand, from South Africa, and from the West Indies, Bermuda. Now, I'm not suggesting universal suffrage. That's not what they were advocating. In the settler colonies, and dominions like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, it would have been, the general population would have been elected, whether English or French Canadian. In the West Indies, it was the white population who were the ones who would get themselves elected. The franchise was not extended at that point, of course, to the non-whites. There was prejudice within the empire. It was a multiracial empire, but that doesn't mean it was an empire without prejudice or discrimination. But the point still was that, at least in principle, imperial federation was that each of the elements would be represented in Westminster. This was not a new idea. Benjamin Franklin had advocated this before the American Revolution. That was his original proposal. When it was rejected by the government in London, Franklin then threw in his lot with rebellion, and the 13 colonies left when they couldn't get a representation in Westminster. Well, similarly, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the authorities in the United Kingdom still had the same view. They opposed imperial federation. Not everybody in Britain, but there generally was this view that imperial federation was not the way to go. They did not want representation from the colonies and dominions at Westminster. And that is the position even today, that in the only a handful left, but the 14 overseas territories of the United Kingdom, some of which are not inhabited, but Bermuda, Turks and Caicos, Cayman Islands, the Falklands, Montserrat, Anguilla, and the Virgin Islands, St. Helena. None of them are represented in Parliament at Westminster. By comparison, the French overseas territories are represented in the Assembly in Paris. So Saint-Pierre and Miquelon has a seat in the French National Parliament, but Bermuda does not have a seat in the United Kingdom Parliament at Westminster. If you are from Bermuda and you are a British citizen, so their full citizenship is now extended to everyone, regardless of race, in the overseas territories. So if you are living in Bermuda, if you're from Bermuda, and you go to the United Kingdom, you can vote in a British election. But Bermuda itself does not have representation.
Why?
Well, that's the question, because the British position right back from the American Revolution has been that somehow that doesn't work. Why, I don't know. I mean, I can't understand it myself, because as a Canadian growing up with federalism, we think it's perfectly natural that the territories, for instance, Yukon, Nunavut, Northwest, have a seat in the Canadian Parliament. But of course they didn't always. The territories, did not in the early days have a seat in Parliament here. So that did evolve. But it's the same situation in Britain dealing with Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales, that there is no English assembly, because especially those England don't seem to want an English Parliament and then a federal system. So I don't know why the Britons have established federations throughout the empire. Canada was a federation, Australia, South Africa was set up as a federation, the West Indies was intended to be, it failed in the West Indies, but it was set up as a federation. So within the empire, federations were always being set up, but the home countries in the UK did not want to embrace federalism, either for themselves or for the empire as a whole. And as a result, that simply didn't go anywhere in the UK. Now, at the same time, even within the Dominions, there was stronger push for imperial federation, I think, in the Dominions, but it never became the dominant view either in the Dominions. The choice that was made was for autonomous dominions within a looser empire rather than a centrally controlled empire. Now, there were people who held other views. The chairman of the Canadian Royal Heritage Trust, Arthur Bousfield, one of his collateral ancestors, Sir William Bousfield, wrote a paper in 1877 advocating imperial federation. So there were people who were promoting it, but it didn't happen. Whether it should have or shouldn't is now history. It was not the choice made from 1897 even up to 1914. By the end of the First World War, the option of imperial federation was off the table. Nobody talked about imperial federation after the First World War, partially because of the major contribution that the Dominions made in the war, and therefore that even increased the nationalist feeling in the Dominions. So while it was hotly debated, men like Stephen Leacock were in favor of it in Canada, but after the First World War, it was a dead issue. Nobody talked about imperial federation. Then, from the First World War to today, I think the parameters had been set. So that period, 1897, 1914, set the parameters that have defined the development of the Commonwealth ever since, leading up to today. And from that period forward, we can look at 5 themes that were considered, some of them predated 1914, but they were still dealt with after that, as a basis for Commonwealth. Perhaps unity is not the right word, but even Commonwealth association. Those were defense, second, economics, third, constitutional relationship, fourth, values, and fifth, sentiment. Now, the 5 overlap, so that the actual policies often covered more than one. An obvious example is the role of the Royal Navy in the 19th century, expanding the empire. Now, the Royal Navy was expanding the empire and taking the Union Jack, if you will, to all 4 corners of the world, partially to protect British trade and imperial trade and to expand trade contacts. So it was an economic benefit that the flag followed trade. At the same time, however, the Royal Navy ended the slave trade. It just prevented ships, not only British ships, but ships from any country, from transporting slaves from Africa to other parts of the world to the extent that they could. Now, the motivation for ending the slave trade was moral. Britain had decided slavery, enough people in Britain had decided slavery was immoral, and therefore Britain had a moral duty to end the slave trade. So the Royal Navy was patrolling the oceans of the world both for economic reasons, to promote British trade, for defense of the empire, and for moral reasons to end slavery. And they might be doing it all on the same day. So it was not, you can't sort of say, oh, this was that's the Navy only did one thing. They did all of the things, but they were still distinct motivation and distinct results, even if they were done simultaneously.